I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
People will return to the people, and so long as men die, liberty will never perish. Soldiers, don't give yourselves to brutes. Men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, or what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle, use you as cannon fodder. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men, machine men, with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machines, you are not cattle, you are men. You are men.
Welcome to the Rock Worldwide Show here on WSHO Sunshine 800 AM, and I am your host, Trey Roberts, and we are going to get into this. Welcome to the new world. Welcome to the world post-Roe versus Wade. We're going to talk today about the fallout behind the historic Supreme Court ruling yesterday in a 6-3 decision in the Dobbs versus Jackson's Women Health organization at the Supreme Court, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and we're going to wade into the waters of propheticness, and I'm gonna do my best to tell you. First of all, let's start off by saying if you want to be a part of the program, you can give us a call at 504-527-0800. You can also go to Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. You can watch us live there. You can jump into the chat rooms there as well. You can comment there. You can go to WSHO.com, scroll down to the bottom, and jump in the chat room, and we'll be looking at your comments throughout the program. But we have so much to get to, and this is going to feel a little bit like the programs that we did, because this, ladies and gentlemen, is where the civics lesson, the 12 weeks of civics that I taught between the election in 2020 and the inauguration in 2021, this is why I taught those lessons. This is why I spent time with you trying to get you to understand the difference between the different levels of government, the local, state, federal, the different branches of government, the executive, the legislative, the judicial, ideas like judicial review, checks and balances, all of these different things, the roles of each of these, the enforcement of law, the creation of law, the interpretation of law, the need for us to be a nation of laws and not a nation of men, the upside, the downside, the misinformation, please stay away from the reports and the news of everything, to not give in to fear of what is being fed to us. And we're going to get into some very technical things today. We knew that it was coming. And yet yesterday still felt like a shock when the Supreme Court yesterday overturned Roe v. Wade, which eliminated the constitutional protections that made abortion in the United States for the last 50 years a right. I spent some time yesterday reading through the 6-3 decision in the Dobbs case and trying to completely stay off of social media, to completely stay off of media, to tune out all of the noise. And I know that it's hard because people were contacting me. I had family members who were contacting me. I had my children who had questions. My wife had questions. We did, some time yesterday with Bob and with Kathleen. So it was just, it's difficult. And what you're going to start to see now, especially on social media, is that gay marriage and maybe even contraception, they're going to be next on the chopping block. And I don't have a judge friend that I could text or call to get some clarity, to get some understanding, some comfort. But I did many, many years ago, when I was far more politically motivated than I am today. 11 years ago, I ran for governor here in the state of Louisiana against Bobby Jindal. I basically ran the campaign that John Bel Edwards ran in an effort to try to get a progressive Republican out of office. Bobby Jindal was horrible in spending. He was a public-private partnership advocate, which is centrally planned government. He was a progressive Republican, and he needed to go. He was not conservative, but he was a friend of Christians, and Christian leaders were invited to the governor's mansion on a regular basis, and they would not support anyone else because they felt that even a little bit of influence in the governor's mansion was better than no influence. Should they take their support for Governor Jindal away and give it to someone like me? I did finish 4th out of the 11 of us that ran. I got almost 35,000 votes statewide. It was an incredible, incredible thing. And during that period of time, I was also a school teacher, a social studies teacher. I attended many constitutional law. I even got a chance to mock trial and argue a Supreme Court case here in downtown New Orleans, in the French Quarter, in the state Supreme Court. I was able to make arguments before a 9-panel of justices and actually argue a Supreme Court case. I reached out to the Solicitor General that had argued the case of Medina versus Rumsfeld. It was a Bush era case where an enemy combatant that was also an American citizen was picked up, and what was his habeas corpus rights, and the original decision was 6-3 on the part of Medina. However, after reading the dissenting opinion from Clarence Thomas and using his arguments in that particular case, and also contacting the professor who was a Solicitor General who tried the case before the actual Supreme Court, he sent me all of his notes and instructed me on what he would do differently. And in doing so, I actually swayed one more justice in our mock trial, and instead of it being a 6-3 result, it ended up being a 5-4 result. We lost nevertheless. But there's a project that you can get involved with called OYE. When the Supreme Court opens up, you may not know this, but they say, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. They say this 3 times. It's spelled OYEZ. And it is a project. If you go to the OYE project, you can look up every single Supreme Court, and you can actually listen to the audio of the arguments made before the Supreme Court, and then they give a summation. We're going to touch on a little bit of that today. So we're going to touch on there's 4 cases, and yesterday we kind of brought it up during the Current Word broadcast, and I want to go into a little bit deeper today. But what is clear today, on the 25th day of June in the 2022nd year of our Lord, is that this decision heralds a new era in our American politics. And we've got 13 states that had trigger laws that include Texas, Alabama, Missouri, Tennessee, and in many other states, abortion is either already or will very soon be illegal. And I told you, now to be honest with you, let me just kind of clarify something here. I did not think that I would ever see Roe v. Wade overturned. Just didn't think that I would see it in my lifetime. Did not think that I would see it. Let me just say unequivocally that the killing of a child, of an innocent human being, for no other reason than for the convenience of the mother, is wrong unequivocally. There is no rational reason for the extermination of a human life in their mother's womb from conception forward. That is my moral argument, and that argument alone is enough for me to take a stand against abortion regardless of the situation. I am, for the most part, I don't think re-traumatizing a woman and compelling her to kill her child after she's been raped, re-traumatizing her or newly traumatizing her is the way to fix a rape situation. I believe that Justice Amy Coney Barrett made the best argument that there is nothing that if a woman carries a child to term and gives that child up for abortion, there is nothing that impedes upon her equality under the law or impedes upon her liberty as an American citizen. I believe Amy Coney Barrett's presence on the Supreme Court and her questions in this particular Dobbs case made all the difference. And she is a New Orleanian, ladies and gentlemen. So thank God for that. I think we also today need to take a special time to thank President Trump. President Trump put on Neil Gorsuch when Antonin Scalia just unexpectedly passed away. I was glad to see when Justice Kennedy, Anthony Kennedy, the moderate who sometimes went left, sometimes went right, when he decided to retire rather, and step down, President Trump got Brett Kavanaugh, of which we will probably see that he will now, moving forward, he will side more often probably with Justice Roberts and the left. We will probably see sort of a more balance on the court where you'll see Gorsuch, Barrett, Alito, and Roberts in the 4, and then you will see more 4. It'll be more of a 4-4 with Roberts being the institutionalist. My prediction moving forward. That being said, besides the fact, so I didn't think that I would see it, but I told you, I warned you that should Roe v. Wade fall, and it has indeed fallen, I warned you that those of you that go out to the abortion clinic and beg these women to not kill their babies, and all the compassion and all of the empathy that you have for these women who are making this decision because you want them to not kill their baby, I told you that you had to pull your big boy and big girl pants up and be prepared that should Roe v. Wade be overturned, that today you would have to have the will and you would have to have the testicular fortitude to today go after the abortion doctors and go after the women who attempt to kill their baby or who aid women in killing their babies and put them in jail. And ladies and gentlemen, today is that day. Now, some of you are not going to have the will. Some of you are not right now in a place. You're just celebrating. Some of you are like, yay, today's a great day. I get it, okay? I really do get it. But there are some new things that we need to talk about. First of all, abortion is still legal in the United States of America. It may not be in states like we talked about, and there's another 6 states whose governors and state legislatures are expected to impose new restrictions. There's another 10 states that have new restrictions already on the table. And all of these are dramatic changes that will alter the lives of American women and their families and the children that would otherwise have been aborted. And these dramatic changes are sweeping more than half of the states in the union. For that, we can all celebrate. But there are so many questions that remain unanswered. And this is where we need to be sober-minded. This is where we need to have some sobriety in our thinking. And this is where we need to lead, and because there are many more questions, especially political questions, that fall outside. For you and for me and for people like Kathleen and Bob and for my buddy Pete and for many of us within a church, Christian setting, the moral argument against abortion will always be enough for us to stand against abortion. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't come to the table and we shouldn't think about and offer suggestions and ponder and wrestle with some of the fallout that will come as a result of the new world that we live in today. Political ones like this. Will Democrats attempt to pass now a national law similar to a law like in Ireland or in France that legalizes abortion under, say, 14 weeks? The Dobbs case that just overturned Roe v. Wade was a 15-week law. So will they legalize it now say 14 weeks and earlier? Will they try to do this? Will the kind of violence that we have seen against pro-life centers over the past few weeks that has gone, for the most part, widely unreported, will it become more widely spread? How will the majority of Americans who are against abortion, but who at the same time who oppose the repeal of Roe v. Wade, how will the majority of Americans come to see the court in the wake of this decision? Will they have the confidence in the Supreme Court? There are practical questions that we need to consider, like what happens when a woman in San Antonio drives to Albuquerque, New Mexico to terminate a pregnancy, and the authorities in Texas then demand that New Mexico extradite her back to the state of Texas. There are cultural questions. How did we wind up with a feminist movement that is policing our ability to say and define the word woman, but has also been unable to safeguard the second wave feminists' most important victory, that being the right to an abortion? In the coming days, you're going to see a lot of reporting and you're going to see a lot of analysis on these questions. And we need to expand our ability to think about these things more than just, it's killing a baby and so we shouldn't do it. Because there are these questions. One of the things I keep thinking about is a piece that I read. She's the editor-in-chief over at Tablet. Her name is Elena Newhouse. Tablet is a very left-wing publication. She wrote a piece last year about the urgency of state power. Keep in mind that we as conservative people, politically conservative people, people who consider ourselves to the center right on the political spectrum, we are the people that do not want a very powerful centralized government intervening in the lives of people. We don't want our government to be a part of our lives and doing a lot of things that we can feel and sense on a day-to-day basis. In that piece that Elena Newhouse wrote about a year ago, she talked about the dawn of a renewed federalism in the 21st century. Quote, "For decades, a strong federal government was the preferred soldier for me, and for many people I knew. No longer. In the era of lockdowns and vaccine passports, and especially the emergence of social credit systems, federal power no longer looked so benign. In the face of this seemingly omnipresent power, where can one find shelter? Well, her answer was the states. Don't like the lockdowns in Brooklyn? Move to Miami. Don't like the income tax in Los Angeles? Consider Juneau. In ways that the founding fathers did not foresee, or did they? We seem to be facing something quite unexpected. A new era of the states is upon us," close quote. That was all from Elena Newhouse in Tablet about a year ago. So what we've seen is we've seen people from New York. We've seen them come down to places like Florida. We've seen tons of people leave Los Angeles and move to Austin, Texas. We've seen people during the coronavirus pandemic. We've seen them locked down. We've pointed out on a regular basis, we've pointed out how the mantra of the left as it came to the abortion issue was my body, my right. But when it came to the COVID vaccine, they seemed to abandon that completely, and they seemed to be interested in making the government give people the jab. I don't want to put the vaccine in my body, made and compulsed by the state. But the left told us we had no right with that. Yet they told us if we wanted to ban abortion, that you couldn't make a woman carry a baby to term because it was her body, her right. There's an incongruency there. There's even a hypocrisy in that line of thinking. But that has made many people on the left embrace what for the longest point, going all the way back to the civil rights era, the civil rights era was a states' right issue. The issue of getting rid of Jim Crow and segregation and most of what Dr. King and the civil rights movement achieved was they convinced the American people that individual states like Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, and in some cases Louisiana, many states in the Deep South that held on to a lot of its civil rights poll taxes and segregation and Jim Crow and just discrimination and prejudice, and using the instruments of government at the state and local levels to discriminate against black citizens, that the federal government ultimately had to step in the way that the federal government stepped in during the Civil War era to ultimately get rid of the institution of slavery. So there has always been this balance between the federal government or the national government, the state, and also the local levels, and where and what branch and what level of government is able to discriminate against people while at the same time not violating their constitutional rights as enumerated in the Constitution. And this is going to be very important because this is what we're seeing now. We are seeing a 21st century federalism where everything is going back to the states. And in many ways, the possibilities of this happening are incredibly promising. To take some of the power away from Washington, D.C. and to return it to, like for here, to return it to Baton Rouge is a good thing for you and me. COVID and crime and school choice have made that abundantly clear. But what meaning does, quote, the laboratory of the states, close quote, have to have the young woman who is, say, raped in Missouri or in Louisiana and unable to afford to travel to a state where abortion is illegal? How are people going to respond and react to these sorts of things? Now listen, I know many of us, I know I do, I know probably most of you out there feel extremely gratified by the Dobbs decision. We know that there are other people out there that are scared and they're worried about what other rights might be under threat. And one of the things that we value most in a show like this, in a radio station like this, in a community here in Louisiana like this, is that a lot of us have different views about highly divisive subjects. But what we share, I believe, a commitment to is a commitment to civility, to respect, to honest and open conversation, even and especially in deeply emotional moments like this one. There are those who claim that the time for nonviolence has passed, that desperate times call for desperate measures. There are people that are going to gin up the idea that we are in a war, and in a war that normal rules of politics must be suspended. These are the same people who turn a blind eye to or justify those threatening the lives of Supreme Court justices with whom they disagree. These are the same people who, in another time, justified violence against abortion providers. I cannot more strongly disagree with this view. We know that it's kind of chic these days to write off virtues like civility and decency and humility and grace. And we believe that those things are the only way forward, and that the only alternative to violence is persuasion and argument. And so I hope that in some small way, the Rock Worldwide Show, with the help of all of its partners and you, those who listen to this radio station here in WSHO, who listen to us on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, we hope that you're able to help us to facilitate that exchange, to provide a forum for good faith arguments, to make it easier for people of varying backgrounds and opinions to forge a greater understanding, not with an eye toward paper-overing our many differences or the profound moral and medical and political implications of yesterday's ruling, but with the hope that might make living together more possible, okay? Now, what I want to do is I want to start with where all of this came from. There was a case called Griswold v. Connecticut. If you are not familiar with Griswold v. Connecticut, let me give you some of the facts of the case. In 1879, let me say that again. In 1879, Connecticut passed a law that banned the use of any drug, medical device, or other instrument in furthering contraception. A gynecologist at the Yale School of Medicine, C. Lee Buxton, opened a birth control clinic in New Haven in conjunction with Estelle Griswold, who at the time was the head of Planned Parenthood in Connecticut. They were arrested and convicted of violating the law, and their convictions were affirmed by higher state courts. Their plan was to use the clinic to challenge the constitutionality of the statute under the 14th Amendment before the Supreme Court. The question that came up before the Supreme Court was, this is 1965 now, okay? So the law that was passed was a law from 1879 where Connecticut said you could not prevent, basically, you couldn't have any sort of contraception. So they banned any drug, any device, any instrument that would prevent contraception, okay? Or conception, rather, okay? So the question before the court in 1965 was, does the Constitution protect the right of marital privacy against state restrictions on a couple's ability to be counseled in the use of contraceptives? Well, the conclusion of the court was a 7-2 decision. Only Justice Black and Justice Stewart dissented, and the majority opinion was written by Justice William O. Douglas. And here was the conclusion. A right to privacy can be inferred from several amendments in the Bill of Rights, and this right prevents states from making the use of contraception by married couples illegal. In a 7-2 decision authored by Justice Douglas, the court ruled that the Constitution did in fact protect the right of marital privacy against state restrictions on contraception. While the court explained that the Constitution does not explicitly protect a general right to privacy, that's key, the various guarantees within the Bill of Rights create penumbras or zones that establish a right to privacy. So this is very important. Basically, before 1965, there was never an idea in United States jurisprudence of this idea of a right to privacy. The Griswold case was the first to establish it, and it says that it does it because there are a number of guarantees within the Bill of Rights that create these zones that establish the right. Together, the First Amendment, the Third Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Ninth Amendment, the 14th Amendment, all create the right to privacy in marital relations according to this particular court. The Connecticut statute conflicted with the exercise of this right and was therefore held null and void. Justice Goldberg, joined by Justices Warren and Brennan, concurred. Rather than finding that the right of privacy was contained in imaginary penumbras, Goldberg located it in the 9th and the 14th Amendments. Justice Harlan concurred, arguing that the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment alone protects the right to privacy. Justice White concurred, arguing that the 14th Amendment was the proper basis for the decision. Justice Black, joined by Justice Stewart, dissented. Unpersuaded by the loose reasoning of the majority, Black felt that there was no way to infer that the Constitution contained a right to privacy. He also dismissed the views of the concurrences that it could be found in the 9th and 14th Amendment. Justice Stewart, joined by Justice Black, filed a separate dissenting opinion. Stewart argued that despite his personal view that the law was uncommonly silly, he felt that the court had no choice but to find it constitutional. Okay, so this court, in the Griswold case, you had the majority basically saying that if we look really, really hard and squint and turn our head to the side and cock the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to a 45-degree angle and dim the lights down to only 20%, we think we sort of kind of see, and so therefore we're going to affirm that there is this thing called the right to privacy, especially in a marital relationship, and therefore we're going to find the Griswold law that banned contraception going all the way back to 1897. 1897, is that right? Make sure my date is correct. Yeah, 1879, sorry. We're going to find that that law that they passed in 1879 by the state of Connecticut is unconstitutional. This was just a couple of years before Roe v. Wade. 8 years later, we get the Roe v. Wade case, and the argument for Roe v. Wade by Justice Black was that the 14th Amendment upholds the right to privacy, and therefore the right to abortion is in the Constitution. Now, everyone that ever wrote anything, and probably, I would say probably the best example of this, if you want to hear I cannot more highly recommend this podcast. This podcast is a Yale law professor who is anti-Roe v. Wade, but he is pro-choice. His name is Akhil Amar. He's one of the youngest Yale law professors. He's a constitutional law savant. He's phenomenal at being able to explain things. Go look in honestly with Barry Weiss and look up the Yale law professor who is anti-Roe but pro-choice. His name is Akhil Amar. I could not more highly recommend that to you. But back to this. That was the Griswold case. The Griswold case was the seeding for what eventually became Roe v. Wade. Then, a case long after Roe v. Wade, in fact, Roe v. Wade was 1973. In 2003, there was a case that went before the Supreme Court, and it was called Lawrence v. Texas. In Lawrence v. Texas, what you have is there was a responding to a reported weapons disturbance in a private residence. Houston police entered John Lawrence's apartment and saw him and another adult man, Tyron Gardner, engaging in a private consensual sexual act. Lawrence and Gardner were arrested and convicted of deviant sexual intercourse in violation of a Texas statute forbidding two persons of the same sex to engage in certain intimate sexual conduct. In affirming, the State Court of Appeals held that the statute was not unconstitutional under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, with Bowers v. Hardwick controlling. So there was the case. These two men were, police were barging in to deal with a separate incidents, caught them in the middle of something that violated a Texas statute, arrested them, and the argument was made under the Griswold and the Roe v. Wade argument that the substantive due process clause of the 14th Amendment should protect the right to privacy for these two people. So the question before the court became, in 2003 now, this is just less than 20 years ago, do the criminal convictions of John Lawrence and Tyrone Gardner under the Texas homosexual conduct law, which criminalizes sexual intimacy by same-sex couples but not identical behavior by different sex couples, violate the 14th Amendment guarantee of equal protection of laws? Do their criminal convictions for adult consensual sexual intimacy in the home violate their vital interest in liberty and privacy protected by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment? So, should Bowers v. Hardwick be overruled? And the conclusion was a no, a yes, and a yes. In a 6-3 opinion delivered by Justice Anthony Kennedy, who has just been recently replaced by Brett Kavanaugh, the court held that the state of Texas statute making it a crime for two persons of the same sex to engage in certain intimate sexual conduct violates the Due Process Clause. After explaining what it deemed the doubtful and overstated premises of Bowers, the court reasoned that the case turned on whether Lawrence and Gardner were free as adults to engage in the private conduct in the exercise of their liberty under the Due Process Clause. Their right to liberty under the Due Process Clause gives them the full right to engage in their conduct without intervention of the government, wrote Justice Kennedy. The Texas statute furthers no legitimate state interest which can justify its intrusion into the personal and private life of the individual, continued Justice Kennedy. And accordingly, the court overruled Bowers. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor filed an opinion concurring with the judgment, and Justices Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia, with whom Chief Justice William H. Rehnquist and Justice Thomas joined, filed dissents. This is what's known as the sodomy law, and this was overturned. This made any state that decided to say that basically homosexual acts, you cannot pass a law that makes their act in private a violation of law due to the same due process found and completely made up in the 14th Amendment. We're going to get to the 14th Amendment in just a second, but there's one more law, and this one's way closer. This is called Obergefell v. Hodges, and this is just from a couple of years ago in 2015. The facts of this case are that groups of same-sex couples sued their relevant state agencies in Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, and Tennessee to challenge the constitutionality of those states' ban on same-sex marriage, or the refusal to recognize legal same-sex marriage that occurred in jurisdictions that provided for such marriages. The plaintiffs in each case argued that the state's statute violated, guess what, the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause of, wait for it, the 14th Amendment. And one group of plaintiffs also brought claims under the Civil Rights Act. In all of the cases, the trial court found in favor of the plaintiffs, but the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit reversed and held that the state's ban on same-sex marriage and the refusal to recognize marriages performed in other states didn't violate the couple's 14th Amendment rights to equal protection and due process. So there were two questions before the court. One, does the 14th Amendment require a state to license a marriage between two people of the same sex? And two, does the 14th Amendment require a state to recognize a marriage between two people of the same sex that was legally licensed and performed in another state? And the conclusion was a 5-4 decision for Obergefell, with the majority opinion being written by Anthony Kennedy. There was a yes and a yes. Justice Anthony Kennedy delivered the opinion of the 5-4 majority, and Chief Justice Roberts wrote a dissent. Listen to Justice Roberts' dissent in this case. He argued that while same-sex marriage might be good and fair policy, the Constitution does not address it, and therefore it is beyond the purview of the court to decide whether states have to recognize or license such unions. Instead, this issue should be decided by individual state legislatures based on the will of their electorate. The Constitution and judicial precedent clearly protect a right to marry and require states to apply laws regarding marriage equally, but the court cannot overstep its bounds and engage in judicial policy making. This is the argument that was made that just overturned Roe v. Wade. So understand what you're going to be hearing. In a moment of panicked honesty, the left, through the media and through academia and through social media, they are scared right now that Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell, which is the legalization or the decriminalization of homosexuality, the legalization of gay marriage, and the potential banning of contraception by states, it's all back on the table. Because as was argued, that has now overturned Roe v. Wade, the right to privacy and the right to substantive due process as found in the 14th Amendment are completely made up rights. There is no right to an abortion in the Constitution. Therefore, it's beyond the purview of the court. It's up to the states to whether or not they want to legalize it or have it illegal. In the case of Dobbs, the case that we just saw, in 2018, Mississippi passed a law called the Gestational Age Act. All they did was prohibit all abortions after week 15 of gestational age. But the Jackson Women's Health Organization, which was the only licensed abortion facility in Mississippi, and one of its doctors filed a federal lawsuit challenging the law and requesting an emergency temporary restraining order. But after the hearing, the district court did in fact grant the TRO while the litigation proceeded to discovery. But after discovery, the district court granted the clinic's motion for summary judgment and enjoined Mississippi from enforcing the law, finding that the state had not provided evidence that a fetus would be viable at 15 weeks. But the Supreme Court precedent prohibits states from banning abortions prior to the viability because in 2018, Roe v. Wade was still the stare decisis. It was still the precedent-setting case. And so the question that went before the Supreme Court was, is Mississippi's law banning nearly all abortions after 15 weeks of gestational age, is it unconstitutional? And what Dobbs found was that no, it is not unconstitutional because there is no right explicitly listed in the Constitution that gives or grants a person. Justice Blackmun basically made it up out of thin air. And this is what even constitutional scholars on the left have known for the last 50 years. This is why people like Clarence Thomas have argued that every single case, Griswold, not because he's against contraception, Lawrence, not because he's against gay sex, Obergefell, not because he's necessarily against gay marriage. Because people like Clarence Thomas, justices like Clarence Thomas, are originalists. And like in a moment of honesty, Chief Justice Roberts' argument that these rights are not in the Constitution. Therefore, the Supreme Court has no jurisdiction. So they must kick it back down to the states. It is up to you. It is up to me in our state, wherever we live, to elect officials who will pass laws that we find congruent with our moral beliefs. The majority of us on here don't believe that you should prevent having children. The majority of us on here that are listening to this right now don't think that homosexuality is God's ideal for us as imagers. The majority of us don't think that you can actually be of a same sex relationship and call it marriage without redefining the actual institution of marriage. If that's what you want to do, and that's where you want to try and persuade and make arguments for, then so be it. If we can separate the moral argument, which for us is all we need, but also at the same time understand that these political questions and these jurisprudent questions and these constitutional questions are going to be at the forefront. And when these things are argued before things like the Supreme Court or federal appellate courts or state district courts or whatever, when these things are argued within a legal standpoint, there is very little that the moral case for these arguments can be made. For instance, if you go to the constitutioncenter.org, if you want to understand the 14th Amendment due process clause, the due process clause of the 14th Amendment is the source of and it has always been the source of an array of constitutional rights, including many of our most cherished and the most controversial, quite honestly. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are known as the Civil War Amendments. These amendments basically were given to us as a result of the abolishment of slavery. When slaves were emancipated and slavery was done away with, there were amendments to the Constitution that had to be passed to make sure that Black Americans were now considered complete and recognized American citizens. with all of the privileges, all the rights, and all of the immunities necessary under the law. It would still take, as we know, it would still take almost another 100 years before the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, before that would actually become the realization. But again, much like how the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as originally written became the seedbed for the abolishment of slavery, so too the passing of these amendments became the seedbed that would ultimately lead to the civil rights movement 100 years later and give us the progress that we've made today. So, some of the protections guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, procedural protections such as the notion and a hearing before termination of entitlements such as publicly funded medical insurance, individual rights listed in the Bill of Rights, including freedom of speech, freedom of exercise of religion, the right to bear arms, and a variety of criminal procedural protections. The fundamental rights that are not specifically enumerated elsewhere in the Constitution, including the right to marry, the right to use contraception, and the right to abortion. So the 14th Amendment has been the amendment, as we read in the 4 cases that we just went through. The 14th Amendment created not specifically, or what they call unenumerated rights. And enumerated rights means that there is, it says, like the First Amendment, for instance. No, the Second Amendment. Let's use the Second Amendment. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed upon. Okay, that is a clear statement of a right. The right to free speech, the right to petition, the right to the freedom of press. Those things are specifically enumerated in the Constitution. There doesn't need to be interpretation. Where you say the right to marry, the right to use contraception, if you want to say that those are constitutional rights, you're going to have to basically make it up. And the way that it's been made up in the past is through the 14th Amendment. So what Justice Thomas has said is that now that we have the case that overturned the most controversial case, the right to abortion, Roe v. Wade, and the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, now the law of the land says that the 14th Amendment does not include a due process clause of protection for rights that are unenumerated in the Constitution. He's simply saying that we need to go and we need to throw away the right to marry. I would be content with that. Get government out of the institution of marriage. Who established the institution of marriage? And one could argue, God. Get government out. Don't just get government out of gay marriage. Get government out of all marriage. We shouldn't need to go to the government and bend the knee to any level of government to get the right to a license to get married. We should go to the church and the church should approve the marriage and perform the ceremony, or you just simply live your life with your person and say that this is my spouse. This is the person that I, have consummated this relationship with. And so therefore, this is my husband. This is my wife. This is who I have committed to. If you don't believe in God, but if you do, you have committed to this person under God and you return the right of marriage to the church, which is an even greater return of rights. The right to use contraception. I mean, if the Plan B pill prevents the fertilization of, prevents the implantation of a fertilized egg, that makes the Plan B pill an abortifacient. It makes it an abortion option, an elective abortion option. The Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment echoes that of the 5th Amendment, but the 5th Amendment, however, applies only against the federal government. After the Civil War, Congress adopted a number of measures to protect individual rights from the interference by the states, and among them was the 14th Amendment, which prohibits the states from depriving any person of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. So the 5th Amendment says what the federal government cannot do as it pertains to due process. The 14th Amendment enfranchised that same right, that the states cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. So guess what that means? That if due process of law is given, then a person's life, liberty, or property can be deprived by the state. Now, that's an extreme statement. But when it was adopted, the clause was understood to mean that government could deprive a person of rights only according to the law applied by the court. Yet since then, the Supreme Court has elaborated significantly on this core understanding. As the examples above suggest, the rights protected under the 14th Amendment can be understood in three categories. 1. Procedural due process. 2. The individual rights listed in the Bill of Rights incorporated against the states. And 3. Substantive due process. The only one that we have time today to really go through is substantive due process. The court has deemed that the due process guarantees of the 5th and 14th Amendments to protect certain substantive rights that are not listed or enumerated in the Constitution is an idea that certain liberties are so important that they cannot be infringed upon without a compelling reason, no matter how much due process is given. The courts to protect unenumerated rights through the due process clause is a little bit puzzling. The idea of an unenumerated right is not strange because the 9th Amendment itself suggests that the rights enumerated in the Constitution do not exhaust others retained by the people. The most natural textual source for those rights, however, is probably the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment, which prohibits states from denying any citizen the privileges of immunities of citizenship. So when the slaughterhouse cases of 1873 foreclosed that interpretation, the court turned to the Due Process Clause as a source of unenumerated rights. The substantive due process jurisprudence has been among the most controversial areas of Supreme Court adjudication. And the concern is that 5 unelected justices of the Supreme Court can impose their policy preferences on the nation, given that, by definition, unenumerated rights do not flow directly from the text of the Constitution. So for the last 50 years, we have been hijacked by 5 Supreme Court justices, decisions who believed that the Constitution should protect a woman's right to have an abortion. And 50 years later, we have 6 justices whose personal beliefs that the Constitution should not have substantive protections against due process, where a right is not enumerated in the Constitution, is where we now live. Locally, the district attorney, we're going to have to, in every single parish, in every single city across this country, we're going to have to start paying attention to the district attorneys that are running for office, and we're going to have to press people like attorney generals of states to force them to force district attorneys and potentially prosecute district attorneys who will not enforce the law. Now, we've got a ton of things that have happened this week. I know that with all of this, in these last couple of minutes, I'm going to try to fly through some of these things and not really give him a lot, but you saw President Biden fall off of his bike. But not the bike that like he was actually riding. It's the bike that's our economy, okay? He's falling off. I know that joke didn't really work. But a couple of updates. Biden's calling on Congress to cut the federal gas tax, okay? His own advisors are telling him that this would save Americans very little money. And yet the president continues to spend the rising cost here in America as the Putin price hike. And this week he trotted out a new culprit for our woes, the owners of gas stations, okay? Like, seriously. The administration is still claiming that the economy is great. Press Secretary Jean-Pierre saying that we don't see a recession right now. We're in a transition where we're going to go into a place of stable and steady growth, whatever. The January 6th hearings this week were a doozy. It looks like that there's a possibility that some Republican members of the House sought pardons from the Trump administration following the election. It looks like Trump's legal team may have tried to plot with members of the Justice Department. Rusty Bowers, the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Arizona, and 2 election workers in Georgia, Ruby Freeman and Wadira Shea Moss, Freeman said that I've lost my name and I've lost my reputation. The White House is embracing a race-focused overhaul of the Federal Reserve. If you're vaping right now, they're going to be banned soon, and pretty soon, almost all nicotine too. Smoking fentanyl on the streets of America is fine, but if you get a nice clean pipe of gentle, city workers and you try to inhale a puff of that Juul e-cigarette, you can soon expect the mighty hand of the federal government to swat it out of your mouth. Because Biden's FDA this week has blocked the popular electronic cigarette company Juul from selling its products in the United States. DeSantis looks to be overtaking Trump in a New Hampshire straw poll this week. I don't know if that's good or not, but we'll see. Our money is on DeSantis v. Biden for 2024. Maybe this is why crime is rising. A New York shoplifter with 121 arrests and 2 felony convictions was caught shoplifting again, and then you know what? Released again. So my kind of pet theory is actually that shoplifters and car window smashers riling up city dwellers about crime are actually a very small group of who are just allowed to reoffend in perpetuity. Republican Senate candidate jokes about shooting moderates. Not a good thing. You cannot go rhino hunting, no matter how clever you think that is for your campaign. A lot of wild stuff happened this week in Texas at the Texas GOP convention. The Texas GOP officially, formally wrote election denial into the party platform, stating that Biden, quote, was not legitimately elected, close quote. Looks like the anti-gay agenda is back. In 2018 and 2020, the Texas GOP also had dropped from their platform the lines denouncing homosexuality generally and gay marriage specifically. This year, the Christian right has roared back. Homosexuality was declared, quote, an abnormal lifestyle choice, close quote, and the platform called for the Supreme Court ruling that legalized gay marriage to be nullified. Speaking of people who want to really lose their cause, NARAL, an ostensibly pro-choice, pro-abortion group that you might think is gearing up for the battle of a lifetime, shoving anyone but their progressives out the door, said that if your feminism, they tweeted out this week, if your feminism doesn't include trans women and girls, it's not feminism. By the way, for those of you keeping score at home, trans women and trans girls are men and boys. If your feminism doesn't understand how anti-trans policies disproportionately impact black and indigenous people of color, or BIPOC folks, particularly black trans women and girls, it's not feminism. By the way, black trans women and black trans girls are black men and black boys. There is a map of Jewish people in Boston, and it's not just anti-Zionism, it's anti-Semitic. Okay, they are now targeting places where people of Jewish businesses are being told, do not go to these places. Guys, we are in some very, very interesting times. Well, that'll just about do it for us here on the Rock Worldwide Show, and I am very happy that we were able to get it done in the time that we did. Thank you for listening. Sorry that we didn't get to. I will hang around in the chat room, and I will also jump into and check on our comments. Looks like we had one comment right there. You mean that gives child up for adoption? Yes, I probably stated that it gives the child up for abortion. Thank you to Stephanie Roberts for correcting me live on the air. Remember to oppose progressivism wherever it rears its ugly head, and go forth and live in this new world. Roe v. Wade has fallen, ladies and gentlemen. Support the light of truth.